It began with a single cough in the quiet hours of a Kansas morning. And before the world could understand what was happening, that single cough would echo into a silence that swallowed 50 million lives. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, the sun rose over Camp Funston in Kansas, a massive military training ground teeming with young men preparing for the trenches of the First World War. In the mess hall, an army cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary complaining of a bad cold. A sudden fever, a sore throat, and a headache that felt like a hammer behind his eyes. The doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of minor ailments in the camp, told him to rest. By noon, over 100 soldiers were lined up outside that same infirmary with the exact same symptoms. By the end of the week, that number had exploded to 500, and the virus had begun its silent march across the globe. This should have been the warning bell, the moment the world stopped to listen. But humanity was distracted. The Great War was consuming every ounce of attention, and this mystery sickness was dismissed as just another casualty of the news cycle. This initial outbreak, known to historians as the Spring Wave, was deceptively mild, moving through the troops like a ghost. Highly contagious, yes, but rarely lethal. It hopped from train to ship, crossing the Atlantic with the American doughboys and landing in the mud and misery of the French trenches. This is where the history books were rewritten by a lie. As the virus tore through the front lines, it didn't pick sides, striking the British, the French, the Germans, and the Americans with equal ferocity. But these nations were at war, and morale was as critical as ammunition. To admit that a plague was decimating the troops would be a sign of weakness, a tactical suicide that no general was willing to commit. So, the censors went to work. Newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin were forbidden from printing a single word about the sickness, burying the truth under headlines of battles won and lost. But there was one country in Europe that wasn't at war. Spain was neutral, its press free, uncensored, and honest. When the virus arrived in Madrid, infecting millions, including King Alfonso XIII himself, the Spanish newspapers screamed the headlines the rest of the world was hiding. They reported the empty streets, the overwhelmed hospitals, and the rising panic. Because Spain was the only one telling the truth, the world pointed a finger and gave the disease a name that would stick forever: the Spanish flu. It was a historic smear campaign, a label born not of origin, but of honesty. By the summer of 1918, the virus seemed to vanish as quickly as it had appeared, the coughing stopping and the fevers breaking. Military commanders exhaled, believing the worst was over, dismissing it as a strange bout of 3-day fever. They were wrong. The virus hadn't disappeared, it had retreated to mutate, shifting its genetic code deep in the lungs of soldiers and civilians, sharpening its weapons for a return that would not be a sickness, but an execution. The summer of 1918 was a deceptive calm before a storm that would shatter the world. In the crowded trenches of the Western Front, the virus had mutated into something terrifyingly efficient. It wasn't just a respiratory illness anymore, it was a hemorrhagic killer. Soldiers, already weakened by years of war and malnutrition, began to collapse not from bullets, but from their own bodies turning against them. This second wave, which exploded in late August, didn't behave like the flu everyone knew. It didn't just target the very old or the very young, it hunted the strong. Men in their 20s and 30s, the prime of their lives, were struck down within hours. They would wake up healthy at Reveille and be dead by nightfall, their lungs filling with fluid so rapidly they essentially drowned on dry land. Doctors watched, in horror, as patients turned a deep, cyanotic blue from lack of oxygen, a grim marker that death was imminent. The virus had learned to trigger a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system where the body's defenses attacked the lungs with such ferocity that it destroyed the very tissue it was trying to save. By October, the virus had escaped the battlefield and was ravaging the home front. In Philadelphia, a city ignoring warnings from its own health officials, a massive Liberty Loan parade was held to support the war effort. Within days, the city's hospitals were overflowing, and the streets were silent except for the rumble of carts collecting the dead. Morgues were overwhelmed, and bodies were stacked on porches like cordwood because there were no coffins left to bury them. Schools, theatres, and churches were closed, and public gatherings were banned, but the virus moved faster than any decree. Panic set in. People wore gauze masks that offered little protection, hoping against hope that a layer of fabric could stop an invisible enemy. The fear was palpable. Neighbors stopped talking to neighbors, and families were torn apart as the sick were isolated in terrified solitude. The world, already bleeding from the wounds of the Great War, was now hemorrhaging from within, losing more souls to a microscopic invader in weeks than 4 years of mechanized slaughter had claimed. The end of the Great War brought a cruel irony to a world already on its knees. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed and a delirious wave of relief swept across the globe. People flooded into the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Sydney, embracing strangers, singing and shouting for joy that the killing had finally stopped. But in that very moment of celebration, the virus found its second wind. The massive crowds became the perfect fuel for a third and final wave that would stretch into the spring of 1919. It was a tragedy hidden in plain sight. The very peace the world had prayed for became the mechanism for one last, devastating purge. This final wave was less ferocious than the second, but it was relentless, picking off those who had miraculously survived the trenches and the autumn horror. It reached the farthest corners of the earth, places the war had never touched. In Western Samoa, a single ship carried the virus to the islands, and within 2 months, nearly a quarter of the population was dead. In India, the devastation was apocalyptic, with an estimated 17 million people perishing, more than all the combat deaths of World War I combined. Entire villages fell silent, their histories and lineages erased in a matter of weeks. By the time the pandemic finally burned itself out in 1920, the statistics were numbing, almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. 1/3 of the global population, 500 million people, had been infected. Between 25 and 50 million had vanished, a staggering 3% to 5% of the human race wiped from existence. In the United States alone, the average life expectancy plummeted by 12 years in a single calendar year. Yet, almost as quickly as it had arrived, the Spanish flu seemed to disappear from the collective consciousness. It became the forgotten pandemic, overshadowed by the political upheaval of the peace treaties, the Roaring Twenties, and the looming shadow of the next World War. Monuments were built for the soldiers who died in battle, but there were no cenotaphs for the millions who died in their beds, gasping for air. The virus didn't truly leave, however. It evolved, becoming a milder seasonal flu that still circulates today as part of the H1N1 lineage. The 1918 pandemic remains a haunting reminder of how fragile our dominance really is, a testament to the time when humanity vanished by the millions, not with a bang, but with a cough in the dark.